governance and power politics, as well as environmental sustainability in the African context. It is an honor to introduce our distinguished lecturer for today, Professor PLO Lumumba. The access citation would properly recognize this academic giant of African descent. Professor Lumumba is a trailblazer in the field of environmental advocacy with a wealth of experience and expertise that span continents. This great son of Africa has dedicated his career to researching and addressing governance or lack thereof and impact on Mother Earth with Africa in focus. As we embark on this intellectual journey, let us open our minds in the possibilities and responsibilities
So thank you, Prof, for the presentation. Right now, we want to invite the patron of access, Mr. Agomo Obina, to read the citation of the presenter. Mazi Obina Agomo, please, would you assist with the citation of the presenter for the day? Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Just
Yes, you can just call online to the maid. I don't know, something like
We await the citation of the speaker, please.
Okay, this is an
Mr. Agoma, sir, your mic is mute, sir. Please unmute your mic, sir.
My suggestion is that we go straight to the lecture. Anybody who wants to read my citation can do so in a different forum because technology is not being very useful to us.
Oh, I didn't know I was even muted. Okay. Now I'm muted myself and I was talking. Can I quickly go through again? Once again?
My own view is that we go straight to the lecture. We are, everybody really, people will know who you are rather than taking time reading my citation. My own view is that people have come to listen to the lecture, and that is what we should focus on. And technology is not very good. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Maybe you go ahead, sir.
Let me say,
please let's welcome Professor Bielo Lumumba to give us the inaugural lecture.
Thank you very much.
Professor Bielo Lumumba.
Okay, Mazi, thank you very much. I've already caused to be circulated, hopefully, my notes on the subject that I'm going to speak to. As you will note, I've posed the question, Whither Africa? And I do so acutely aware that whatever we talk about, whether it's the environment, whether it's education, it cannot be seen in isolation from the history and the state of Africa. And that is why, therefore, at the very outset, I remind my audience that Africa's current circumstances must be seen in the context of her colonization. It is always very easy when we talk about Africa to talk about her as if she were homogeneous. But we forget that in 1884 and 1885, the continent of Africa was divided by the European powers in Berlin, with the consequence that the continent was divided into spheres of influence. The British had their sphere of influence, the French had their spheres of influence, the Germans had their spheres of influence, the Italians had their spheres of influence, the Germans had their spheres of influence, the Portuguese. And it is not until the end of the World War that Germany lost some of her spheres of influence, such as in East Africa, in what today is called Tanzania, such as in parts of the Cameroons and parts of what is now known as Benin and Dahomey, and Southwestern Africa, which is now known as Namibia. But the ideology and the philosophy governing the colonial powers is one that is known to us. It was an ideology that was informed by the desire to take our resources, so that those of us who are from Liberia will know that the rubber that was taken out of Liberia and destroyed the environment was at the behest of the colonizing powers. Those of you who are from countries such as Togo and Cote d'Ivoire and what is present-day Ghana will know that the cocoa was taken out for that purpose. And of course, at that time, the minerals were quite attractive. Those of you who are from countries such as Kenya and of course Tanzania and Uganda will know how coffee and tea Those of you who are from Gabon or from the Democratic Republic of Congo will know things such as lumbering. That was the character of the colonial administration before Africans started agitating to regain their independence. And the struggle for independence was therefore a struggle, among other things, not only to acquire political power, but also to ensure that African countries would take charge of their affairs from an economic standpoint and be in charge of our resources, both human and natural, for the purposes of benefiting the Africans of the day. It is in that context, therefore, that we must see the struggle for liberation. And the struggle for liberation is one whose history is well recorded by many writers. And in my view, it is not this forum that we should use to talk about it. Safe to point out that through the agitation for the struggle for independence, we now have countries that regained their independence. But we must backtrack a little. Africa must always also be seen in the context of our sons and daughters who left the continent and are to be found in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, in the United States of America, in Latin America, in countries such as Brazil, and in Europe. And many of you will remember that in the late 19th century, some of the Africans, such as Sylvester Williams and other Pan-Africanists, who started talking about the whole idea initially of returning to the continent of Africa, and ultimately they gave birth to what we now know as Pan-Africanism, culminating in the much more famous Pan-African Conference in 1945 in Manchester, which was attended principally by people such as Kwame Nkrumah and Nigeria's Obafemi Awolowo. So that when the struggle for independence ensues, the much more famous acquisition of independence is Ghana's independence on the 6th day of March, 1957. Those of you who know history will know that a year earlier, what is now known as the Sudan also had regained her independence in 1956 from the Anglo-Egyptian control. And when the struggle for independence had started yielding fruits, with Ghana regaining her independence, you will remember those immortal words of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah on 6th day of March 1957, when he said that the independence of Ghana meant nothing if the rest of Africa was not independent. So that when Nkrumah then convenes meetings in 1958 in order to give impetus to the decolonization of Africa, and holds another meeting again in Morocco in 1960, and ultimately holds the meeting in 1963, convened by Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. At that time, 32 African states have already regained their independence. And the mantra on the day, in the meeting that is held between the 23rd to the 25th days of May 1963, is that we must liberate the countries that have not regained independence. You will remember at that time that what is now South Africa was already under the control of the apartheid regime, as well as Namibia, which was then known as Southwestern Africa, and all the Portuguese colonies to include Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde, and of course, Sao Tome and Principe. So that the whole idea of having total liberation of Africa is at the very heart of the movement that is initiated in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and then subsequently headquartered in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. This history is necessary in order for us to appreciate that even when we talk about environment, we can never do so in spite of the activities of the political nature under which we promised ourselves that we would be guardians of our resources. And when we are talking about guardianship of our resources, we are talking about not only human resource, which I consider to be the most important resource, and we never talk about it as often as we should, but also guardians of our natural resources. We are telling ourselves that we are going to take charge of our resources. If it is mining, we are going to mine in a manner that is going to ensure that the environment is protected. If it is agriculture, we are going to do so to ensure that it is in a manner that the soil is protected. If it is in the question of the use of our rivers and other river resources, whether it's the Nile Basin, whether it is the Congo Basin, whether it is the Niger Basin, we are going to use our waters in a sustainable fashion. That must never be lost on us. And that is why, therefore, you must understand the context in which I'm talking about the whole question of liberation and what we promised ourselves under it. Be that as it may, when we regain independence and when we have started taking charge of our affairs as individual countries, remember that when we regain independence, we do not regain independence as Africa. We regain independence as individual countries which are still controlled by the erstwhile colonizers, so that the former British colonies regain independence as such, and they are still grouped under what we call the Commonwealth of Independent Nations, whose titular head remains the British monarch. And this is going to be very important when I talk about the neo-colonial project. The former French colonies are in a much worse space because France does not even leave. France continues to control most of our affairs. And many of you here will remember the kind of activities that the French engaged in Algeria and Guinea-Conakry, when the Algerians and the Guineans voted no to what is sometimes referred to as the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, which has seen many former French colonies to continue to see their countries and their economies being controlled from Paris, including the printing of their currency, the CFA franc. The Portuguese colonies, of course, do not regain their independence easily. Indeed, you will note that many of the former Portuguese colonies regained their independence through sustained armed struggle. And this must be understood in the context that Portugal herself was under a dictatorship of Marcelo Caetano. And it is only when the government of Marcelo Caetano is overthrown by Antonio de Spinola that we begin to see the British, the Portuguese colonies such as Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde regaining their independence. But that is important to the extent that it tells us that even when African countries regain their independence, they do so on the basis of alien law, so that the British colonies regain their independence and have a legal system which is a replica of the legal system in the United Kingdom. The French colonies also regained their independence on a replica of laws that are inherited from France. And so too with the Portuguese, and so too with the former Belgian colony of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, Rwanda and Burundi. And in that regard, therefore, when we talk about resource management, we must never for one moment forget that the legal regimes under which African countries operate is not a unified legal regime. It is not Afrocentric. It is still Francocentric. It is still Anglocentric. It is still Lusocentric, and therefore does not address the realities of the continent of Africa, which, as you know, is divided into 54 countries or 55, depending on who you are talking to. Those are the circumstances in which we find the continent of Africa. And therefore, when you look at many of the treaties to which African countries accede after regaining their political independence, they are treaties to which African countries were not privy. They were entered into by their former colonial masters. Let me give an example. If you look at the Nile Basin, for example, the 1929 Nile Treaty was signed by the British and the Egyptians. And so too with the 1959 treaty, which deals with how the waters of the Nile are going to be utilized. And when the British are entering into the Treaty of 1929 and 1959, they do so because they are controlling Egypt, they are controlling Sudan, they are controlling Uganda, they are controlling Kenya, they are controlling Tanzania, and the use of the Nile is for their benefit anyway. But when the countries regain independence, you now have Egypt as an independent country, Sudan as an independent country, South Sudan after 2011 as an independent country, Ethiopia as an independent country, of course, never colonized, Kenya as an independent country, Uganda, and of course, Tanzania, and including Rwanda and Burundi, which are considered to be in the Nile Basin. The countries now assert their sovereignty because they are no longer under the control of a single power, and the use of the waters affect their national sovereign interests. That must be seen in that regard. The same thing when you go to West Africa and you look at the Niger Basin, which is covering a number of countries in that part of the world, or the Mano River, and you discover that each of those countries now want to utilize those resources in a manner that is specific to their needs. The same too when you go down south to the Limpopo, and the same too when you go into the Congo Basin and you want to look at the waters of the Congo, and you want to see how the Democratic Republic of Congo is now looking at her rainforest. Is it for the benefit of the Democratic Republic of Congo? The same too with Gabon. And this is something that then affects every other country. If you go into the mining sector, when the Nigerians are drilling oil in the Delta, it affects everybody else, but it is subject to the sovereignty of Nigeria, which controls that area. The same too when the Congolese are drilling their oil, and the Gabonese are drilling their oil, and the Ghanaians are drilling their oil, or when they are fishing in those waters. All these countries, despite the fact that they are African countries, are looking at their interests in that narrow way. And remember that the colonialist has not left. The colonialist is still alive and well. And that is why we are talking about the neo-colonial project. That is why Kwame Nkrumah is writing about neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and he is warning African countries as early as 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, that we have all regained independence on the basis of little countries, most of which, or some of which, are completely unviable. If we want to participate in world arena, and we want to ensure that we enjoy the dividends of our independence, Kwame Nkrumah is saying, it is imperative that we unite now, that we have one foreign policy now, that we have one currency now, that we have one army now, that we are going to relate with the world as a united force. Of course, his voice is not heard, and we end up with the Organization of African Unity, which is a loose union, which does not interfere with the internal affairs of any country. And that is how Africa continues to be divided, and that is how the neo-colonial project still continues to be alive and well. And you see the first generation of leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, or particularly Kwame Nkrumah, are then removed from power by the CIA, we now know, and by the Western power. That is how we see people like Patrice Emery Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo removed. That is how we see people like Sylvanus Olympio removed. That is how we see the coup d'etat against Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in Nigeria. That is how we see the elimination of Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria. That is how we see the removal of people like Modibo Keita. That is why you see instability in the continent of Africa, because Africa is the home of resources. It is the home of resources which must be exploited. And therefore, that is why the neo-colonial project remains alive and well. But even in the face of all those, African countries individually and collaboratively are always alive to the reality that in order to ensure that they gain the dividends of independence, there is need for collaboration. It is in this context that you must see the attempts very early on in the 1960s and 70s, notwithstanding the failure to create African Union. That is how you can see the organizations such as the East African Community, the South African Community, ECOWAS, Central Africa, and Kenya, Nigeria, as Uganda, we are weak, but when we come together, we can have all these dividends. But all these are not happening in an environment which is without interference. The Europeans are interfering, and they are telling us through bilateral arrangements or multilateral arrangements and promising us heaven. That is how you see the European communities agreements that they enter into with Africa, such as the Lomé Convention, the Cotonou Convention, and all these are targeted at the African resources, whether it is mining or timber or any other thing, but resources remain the goal. Fast forward, what do we see? We see an Africa that is a hunting ground. We see an Africa that continues to lose our resources because of bad contracts that are entered into with these powers. And remember that while in the early days, we were talking about the traditional colonizers from Europe, there are new entrants into the arena. After the World War II, the United States of America becomes the major hegemon and is also through her companies now interested in the resources of Africa. The Soviet Union is also another entrant into the continent of Africa, so that Africa has become a playground. And remember, she is always a playground because of her resources. In the early days, it was her human resources. In these days, it is her natural resources, including the agricultural produce that Europe and America get from her lands. So that Africa is in that space. And even in the face of all these difficulties, Africans are beginning to realize that going forward, we can only protect ourselves if we trade more. It is in that context that we must understand the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, where Africans promised themselves, we are going to conduct a lot more trade amongst ourselves. Of course, the Lagos Plan of Action does not lead to very much. And ultimately, we find ourselves in the spaces which we still are, namely that our resources are still being taken away. The mining practices that we engage in throughout Africa are mining practices that compromise our environment. We see this in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We see this in the oil drilling in the Delta in Nigeria. We see this in Ghana. We see this in the manner of the use of pesticides in different parts of Africa. We see this in the pollution of our lakes and rivers. We see this in the indiscriminate lumbering of our forests. We see these everywhere, and we see our environment being compromised. We see the introduction of exotic trees and exotic crops, and we see the death of our indigenous crops, and we see the emergence of major players in the agricultural sector, such as Syngenta and Monsanto, and we see the loss of our seeds, and therefore the Lagos Plan of Action doesn't take us very far. Then we find ourselves once again ensnared into an international web where we enter into treaties and agreements which are Eurocentric and Americocentric. Some may say they enjoy universality, but the manner and the philosophy underpinning them are alien to the needs of Africa. So that in 1972, when the world meets in Stockholm for the Treaty on the Environment, we are talking about a treaty we signed into them, but the underlying philosophy is alien to us. And you must see, even when the world meets in Montego Bay in Jamaica to talk about the law of the sea, we are there, but somehow we are not there, except that the exclusive economic zone was an idea of the Kenyan professor Frank Njenga. And when we go through all these and we go to the Kyoto Protocol, we go to Rio in 1992, we go to Kyoto, we go to Paris, we have all these COPs, you must always remember that Africa is disadvantaged. And we are in international web where our voice is weak. And it is in that context that we must always understand this statement of Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere when he is the guest of honor at the 40th anniversary of Ghana's independence on the 6th day of March, 1997. And this is what Mwalimu said: Africa must unite. Because this indeed was the title of Kwame Nkrumah's book. This call is more urgent now than ever before. Together, we, the peoples of Africa, will be incomparably stronger internationally than we are now with our multiplicity, than we now are with a multiplicity of unviable states. The needs of our separate countries can't be and are being ignored by the rich and the powerful. The result is that Africa is marginalized, with international decisions affecting our vital interests being made without our participation, or if we participate in a nominal manner. Unity will not make us rich, but it can make it difficult for Africa and African peoples to be disregarded and humiliated. And it will therefore increase the effectiveness of African decisions, and we will be able to implement development if we are united. My generation of Africans led Africa to political freedom. The current generation of leaders and peoples of Africa must pick up the flickering of the African freedom, refuel it with enthusiasm and determination, and carry it forward. And that is how, therefore, Mwalimu Nyerere is charging us to take the flame which they left flickering and to move it to the next agenda, begging the question, whither Africa? Whither Africa must therefore, where are we going? In the last few years, we have seen us being a part of the Millennium Development Goals. We are now a part of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were 8. Sustainable are now 17. We cannot quarrel with them because they address every aspect of our lives. They affect our environment. They affect our well-being as human beings in terms of human rights. They touch agriculture, they touch water, they touch everything. And concurrently, we in the continent of Africa have also recognized that we must have certain things and certain approaches that are Afrocentric. It is in that regard that we must understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is created under the overarching objective agenda of Africa Agenda 2063. Founded and supported by 7 pillars, whose agenda is to ensure that Africa must organize herself and have a voice in the world on the basis of culture, on the basis of human rights, on the basis of good governance, and on the basis of husbanding her environment in a proper way. And therefore, when we talk about sustainable development and we talk about the climate change, we are doing so in the context of the history that I have given in a broad brush manner. But we are telling ourselves the following, that if Africa is to be effective, if Africa is to realize our potential, these are the things that Africa must do. Number one, Africa must, as much as possible, conduct our affairs in a coordinated and a coherent manner. We can continue to have our sovereign countries, but we must be prepared to surrender aspects of our sovereignty so that when we are relating to the world can hear a coherent voice. The world can hear a coherent voice in matters relating to trade. When we are talking about the environment and we are saying that we don't want pesticides and we don't want fertilizers that will affect our soil, that voice must be a voice that emanates from Dhaka in Senegal and reverberates in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and is also found in Bangui in Central African Republic and indeed everywhere. When we are talking about and against GMO food, we want to hear that all African countries are saying that we want our soil to only have organic material in it. When we are talking about the preservation of our forests, particularly indigenous forests, we should be speaking with one voice from Gabon to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to Ethiopia. When we are talking about pollution, we must be speaking with one voice. When we are talking about preserving our water resources, it must not only be the Nile Basin, it must speak to the 19 lake basins in Africa that will touch the Great Lakes in Central and East Africa. It must also touch the lakes to be found in Ethiopia, to be found in Tanzania, to be found in the Sahelian region, so that we are speaking about the same thing. When we are talking about irrigation and the use of those resources, we must also be talking about the same thing. When we are talking about drilling of oil, the same language must be spoken in Angola as it must be spoken in Ghana and in Nigeria and in Uganda. And when we are talking about fishing in our waters, the same language must be spoken in Somalia as indeed it is in Sierra Leone or Liberia. And we must do this in a coordinated manner so that the world knows that we are speaking from the same voice, or with the same voice and from the same standpoint. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I'm suggesting to us that Africa can only realize her potential when she is organized. Africa can only realize her potential when her policies are coherent. Africa can only be effective in the world when at international fora she participates in signing and debating and negotiating treaties which are Afrocentric. And Africa can only do so under the aegis of an organization which is funded by Africans and under an organizational system that is informed by African intellectuals. And this is true in every sector, whether it is in the area of the environment or indeed any other area. Which brings me to my last point, the enabling environment. The enabling environment can only be created if our politics is right. And this is why at a different fora, I've talked about political hygiene. Political hygiene must be understood, therefore, to mean the creation of an environment where our policies and our legal regimes are enablers. They enable all parties, whether in the public arena or in the private arena, to have a legal regime that is predictable, that is conducive, and enables countries and private sector to participate in a manner that gives them confidence and guarantees results in a manner that will be beneficial to the continent of Africa. Lastly, therefore, I am also suggesting that this can only be achieved when we have a quality of men and women that are capable of contributing positively, which therefore demands that our human resource must be a human resource that is trained and specifically designed to ensure that he or she is conducting himself or herself in a manner that will be beneficial to the continent of Africa. And it is in this regard that I understand those famous words of Kwame Nkrumah when he said that Africa needs a new kind of man and woman, a new kind of man and woman who is sensitive to the needs of the continent of Africa, a new kind of man and woman who understands what Africa wants, a new man and woman who is capable of serving Africa with dedication. And I conclude with this caveat. This world that we live in is a world where the competition is cutthroat. It is a world where there is a new scramble for Africa. You see, the Americans are here, the British are here, the Europeans are here, the Russians are here, the Turks are here, the Arabs are here, the Indians are here, the Chinese are here. Why are they here? Is it because they love us? No, it is because they love our resources. And the only way in which we can work with them is if we are strong, organized, and dedicated, so that when we relate to them, we do not allow them to be parasitic upon our environment and upon our resources. We allow them to engage with us in a manner that will be symbiotic, because the truth be told, fortune favors the vigilant, and the world is still controlled by what I call the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest and the dying of the least suitable. Africa must be fit in order to survive. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you, Prof. We want to welcome questions. We have to receive questions.
Okay, I want to thank the presenter for the presentation. Thank you very much, Prof. We are very grateful. It's an honor to have you speak to our Kibuland Society for Environmental Sustainability. At this juncture, I want to ask that if anybody has one or two questions or comments to make, they are free to do that. Just raise up your hands, I'll unmute you, or just raise up your hands, then you unmute yourself and speak. we can do this as snappy as possible. Professor Kala, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof, for this very thought-provoking lecture and for awakening us right on time before it gets too late. My concern is, how do we upscale this message across the continent of Africa, and how do we get our leaders who, in my opinion, would need to hold them also responsible for us to unite and get a common message, whether at the platform of African Union or in the Organization of African Unity. But I feel that it is very important that we set out from this particular organization also what our next steps would be. We in Nigeria, can we have other partners from Congo, from Kenya, from Mozambique, in which, we would be speaking with one voice, especially on matters of environmental issues where our focus is at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. My suggestion is this. This organization is one that brings together seasoned professionals. And I hold the view that with the expertise that resides in Al-Kebulan, one of the major things that you must do in the course of next year is to convene a meeting which is hybrid, both virtual and physical. And in this day of technology, invite as many individuals and organizations as possible for the purpose of putting together a working party, which working party will then come up with suggestions, which will then be communicated to all heads of states and government in the continent of Africa and to the African Union, and thereafter seek to have audience at the ordinary session of the African heads of states and government. It is by doing so that you will bring these matters to the fore. In the early days, we may have difficulties, even meet resistance from the many bureaucrats within the African Union. But I think that that is one of the things that this organization and the academics and other activists who are members should plan to do in the coming year. And I think that is doable, it is deliberate. And because we now have the advantage of technology, convening such a meeting should not be too difficult. We must achieve that.
Thank you very much, Prof. Do we still have other comments and questions, please? Please feel free to do so. You can unmute yourself and make your question, ask your questions, please. All right, Prof, I have a student here from the University of Benin who wants to ask a question. He will introduce himself first and then ask the question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's indeed an honor and a privilege to listen to your lesson today. It's been quite a follower of your work so far. My question for this lesson is this. So, looking past the era of colonization and what has been done to Africa in the past, how can we put in measures to make Africa smarter to be able to prevent such agreements from being made again today? And secondly, I believe lessons like this should also be very much communicated to the youths. What structures are we putting in place to ensure that the youths are getting these exact lessons? Because the youths are the leaders of tomorrow. We need to get this knowledge, we need to get these ideas and make the change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being present because you represent young Africans. And once and Kerubulan is an organization that I believe is capable of replicating itself in different ways. And I'm glad that the University of Benin is involved. One of the ways in which this can be done is to have chapters at universities. And if you have chapters at universities where faculties that are responsible for environment or where environmental studies are conducted, that would be the focal point. And in that way, and I hope that Al-Kebulan and the founders will organize something even in the nature of a competition that enables young people at different levels of education to participate and to focus on issues involving the environment. And once again, we are lucky to live in times when communication can almost be instantaneous, so that what we have discussed today, you'll be shocked that it will be communicated to diverse groups of people across the continent of Africa and outside of the continent of Africa. And I would myself challenge you by asking you, what are the ideas that you have? You as a young person, which you can share with the professors at Al-Kebulan so that they can enrich those ideas and use those ideas to communicate with younger people. So the ball you threw at us, we also throwing it back at you and expect you to respond to us with concrete proposals on how you think that this can be implemented.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let's take just one or two more questions and then we call it a wrap. Okay, Yusuf, Mohammed, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, good evening to you all. My name is Yusuf Muhammad Sanyina from Nigerian Army University View. I would like to first thank Prof. Pielo Lumumba for this very insightful lecture. My concern is the leaders of Africa, because I know that many policies are being initiated, but implementing them becomes very difficult. How can the implementation be very simple, especially for the betterment of Africa? Thank you.
Yusuf, my answer to you is this. We are not the only continent with leaders who don't do what we desire. And I think that one of the things that we in the continent must begin doing, we have agonized for too long, we have complained for too long, we'll continue to complain, we'll continue to agonize, but we should also organize ourselves. Because when pressure is brought to bear on those who are in political arena, they will have no choice but to succumb. Only last week here in Kenya, we launched something called the Pan-African Institute. And it is our intention that the Institute will work with other organizations. And once we have ideas that are clear and are properly articulated, we can indeed ensure that the political class do what is good and right. It is the duty of the citizens to wake up. And I'm suggesting that we African citizens, we complain too much and we don't do much in order to bring pressure to bear on the political class. And they know it. They know it is only a few who complain, and they know that those few can be ignored. But if we increase the numbers and we begin to bombard relevant institutions, if it is in the region, some of these, like the outcome of these deliberations, for whatever it's worth, you send it to all African heads of state, you send it to the ECOWAS Secretariat, you send it to the SADC Secretariat, you send it to the East African Community Secretariat, Central Africa, the Maghreb, so that there is this information that is in the public domain. Then in a short time, the politicians will begin to recognize that they cannot ignore these voices. See what is happening in India, in agriculture, in the environment. See what is happening in Japan. See what is happening in Korea. See what is happening in China. See what is happening in Thailand. The voices of the people cannot be ignored. See what is happening in the Amazon. How the indigenous people cannot be ignored. We must conduct ourselves in a manner that will make it impossible to be ignored by the political class. It can be done. It must be done. And I want to refer you to a case which was about an environmental case in Philippines. It's a famous case. Those who are in environment will know about it. Oposa versus Factoran was a case that was filed by an individual. And the whole idea was saying that environmental protection is an intergenerational duty. And that case has become a case that is now cited the world over because one individual woke up, went to court. The court made a decision which could not be ignored. And because it could not be ignored, policies had to be formulated, laws adopted, and the world will never be the same again.
Thank you very much, sir. May we have the patron of Access, Mazi Agomo, to ask his question or make comments?
Yes, first of all, let me thank Professor Piero Lumumba for his wonderful submission. And I want to ask a question as though I'm trying to make comment, but I put it like a question to Professor Piero Lumumba. Sir, we have seen the role of the Francophiles, I mean the Francophone countries, the role that they play in as regards the unity of Africa. And I am asking, because this issue of one language, of different languages that is being spoken in Africa, borrowed languages, so to say, by our colonial masters or SY enslavers. Is it not possible for, through the African Union, to call themselves to say, look, let us have one language enshrined in our school's curriculum, such that, say, in 20 years' time, our children will speak in one language. If we have one language, one African language, say Swahili, for example, enshrine in our school curriculum and make it compulsory, just as they have made English, French, and other SY colonizers' language compulsory. Can we not do that for Africa? Can we not have, say, Swahili enshrined in our school curriculum so that it becomes compulsory? At that point, then we can't be talking of one language, because what I see as a challenge in Africa is this language thing. Whenever the African Union wants to say, okay, let us do this, the next thing, the other wing, particularly the Francophiles, will just go the other way. So is it not possible, sir, that we have our school curriculum, have one language enshrined in our school curriculum, sir? Thank you.
Thank you, Mazi. It is your countryman, fella Nicola Pokuti, who sang, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense." And whenever I listen to that song, I understand very well what fella was saying, that we must ask ourselves what we teach our young men and women, because that is who they become. I think Africa has now entered a stage where they are saying that language is important. And you will note that the African Union has now adopted Kiswahili as a possible lingua franca, and a number of countries have started teaching it in Southern Africa. Of course, there are those who have been saying that we should also allow Amharic to be a language, we should allow Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa to be a language. But the beauty is, nobody is saying that you kill those languages, not at all. What we are saying is that the time has come that we must adopt a language which we can say that is an African language. And that language we are saying is Kiswahili. And Kiswahili has very many credentials, which I think makes it the language of choice. If you have listened to the African Union anthem, which is rendered in beautiful Kiswahili, you will like it. I agree with you more, but will require people who are crusaders for the language of Kiswahili. But as we do that, and we are waiting for 20 years for the first generation of those who graduate in that language to come, I believe that we can use these languages positively. Our problem is that we have allowed ourselves in Africa. You hear somebody saying, I'm Francophonie. Somebody saying, I'm Anglophone. Somebody saying, I am Lusophone. In the Cameroon, you hear people depicting the conflict in Cameroon as a language conflict involving the English speakers and the French speakers. That is the neo-colonial definition. In Europe itself, you know that the European Union conducts its business through 27 languages. So language is not a problem in itself. Is how you choose to identify yourself and whether you know yourself. Marcus Garvey delivered a wonderful speech in say, know yourself. Once you've known yourself, then you will be able to do that which is in your best interest. And I have no doubt that indeed, as you rightly suggested, one of the things we ought to do is to begin to have a language, a working language, which is an African language, which will make us coordinate our affairs and liberate ourselves from these languages, some of which have caused great difference amongst us in a negative way.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll just have two more comments. One will be from the username Galaxy. Maxwell's iPhone. Sorry, Maxwell's iPhone. Kindly introduce yourself because I don't know if anybody bears that name, Maxwell's iPhone. So sorry,
Hi.
please introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Kajagwe. This is Maxwell Chibogo. I finished from University of Benin. Um, I'm very, what I say, excited and happy to hear Professor Barrister Pielo Lumumba talk. He's one of the, or you, since you're here, you're one of the inspirations I've had ever since growing up and my introduction to Pan-Africanism. And so listening to you today has been really, really invigorating. Thank you so much. My question slash comment is about the outlook of countries and organizations like international organizations that have the best interest or that have an economic interest in keeping African nations separated or disunited. So, what do you think can be done to thwart the efforts of these countries or these international organizations that have some sinister interest in keeping us separated or going against the Pan-African idea? And also, secondly, what are your thoughts on internal conflicts too? Like our politicians, like you've said, you've always hammered on the need for hygiene in politics in Africa and how we are technically the ones pulling ourselves down if we can focus. And how do we fight those two internal challenges and external challenges and I guess making Africa to prosper economically? Because like you said, these countries are the 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 followers or the stooges of these countries and these companies are in Africa for one reason, not because they like us or because they want the resources that they perceive that we can give them or they can steal from us. So how do you think we can, I don't want to say fight back, but these are definitely oppositions that are in our way, whether they're overt or covert?
Okay, Prof, you might want to respond to that, please.
Let me say this. African countries and the African continent is not the only continent that faces these adversities. We as a continent and as a people must be smart. The Chinese, who are doing their things and are rising in a similar environment, have done so through being organized. We must organize. Nobody is going to create a perfect condition for us to thrive. We must thrive in the midst of adversity. China is rising in the midst of adversity. India is rising in the midst of adversity. Indonesia is rising in the midst of adversity. Turkey is rising in the midst of adversity. The Emiratis are rising in the midst of adversity. What does Qatar have that Nigeria does not have? What does Turkey have that the Democratic Republic of Congo does not have? What does India have that South Africa does not have? In other words, we have all the ingredients that can make a recipe for success. Our weakness is disorganization, disunity, and susceptibility to manipulation by those who buy some of our leaders for little pennies. That is where we must address our minds, and if we do so, then we can realize our potential. And remember, it is not only the continent of Africa that have faced these adversities. All peoples face these adversities and they fight them. The time is to fight them now. And if we do, we are going to succeed, the headwinds notwithstanding.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll have just the final question or comment from Abubakar Husseini Sifawa.
So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. I will hand over to the moderator.
Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof, for this beautiful lecture. We are very grateful. It's a privilege to have our very own giving us this presentation all the way from Kenya. We have persons that have participated in this lecture from USA, from Canada, from African countries like Morocco. We are all very grateful. Thank you very much. I want to use this medium to welcome everyone to access Akebulan Society for Environmental Sustainability. You can visit our website on akebulansustainability.org for further information. You can also visit the website to receive a soft copy of this video. We want to say thank you, everyone, for participation, and we want to call on Agomo Mazi, Mr. Mazi Agomo, for a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, our able secretary, the moderator, Dr. Mrs. Chubu. Thank you so much. Yes, let me first of all, start by, thanking Professor Pielo Lumumba, who, in his usual style, have rejigged the minds of Africans once again. Yes, I want to believe, like he has rightly said, whether we are trying to preserve, conserve, and sustain the African resources, one thing is key. We need unity. Africa needs unity to be able to realize our potentials. And we must understand this. Every other nations apart from Africa are united. And the reason for their unity is Africa. The first unity against Africa was during the Berlin Conference. And that is why no African was invited. No leader of Africa was invited in that meeting. So that is the position. They are united against Africa. So the only thing we put people to ourselves is unite.
Big guy. What do you think, man?
I want to thank every one of you who has found
you know, people are saying no go shop because they travel.
Like I said again, once again, I want to thank
you say guy small, why you not carry Gary from your buy
taking time out of his high schedule
make the one
to make this event a worthwhile. I want to thank the chairman of Akebulan, Professor Geoffrey Obinna Anoliefo, for doing this wonderful job, putting together this team to midwife this conference. I want to thank every one of you. Professor Beckley, you have been directing wonderfully well. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who attended. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We appreciate you. Thank you.
So I want to thank everybody. We hope to have another event very soon. Bye. Bye.